Good afternoon. Senator Jim Sasser of Tennessee is the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. He is now in his third term from Tennessee, graduate of Vanderbilt University and that school's law school. He comes from party politics. He had his first political baptism of fire working on behalf of Senator Estes Kefauver, one of America and certainly the South's most renowned Democratic populists and a presidential candidate himself in the 1950s. Jim Sasser has been in the Senate since 1976 when he defeated the Republican incumbent, chairman of the Republican National Committee, later United States Trade Representative Bill Brock. He was overwhelmingly reelected in both 1982 and 1988 and honored by his colleagues as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, where he has been intimately and personally and hourly involved in the budget deficit. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Jim Sasser of Tennessee.
Well, thanks very much, Mark Shields. Good afternoon to you all, and I want to thank my great good friend who I walked in with, the former chairman of the House Budget Committee, Jim Jones. You know, I think Jim knows as well as anyone else the splendid misery of chairing a committee that must put together a budget for the government of the United States. In fact, I think Jim Jones's new position is exactly at the opposite pole from his former responsibilities. Now, with a budget for the United States government, we simply can't get anything started. But on the stock exchange, it appears that sometimes you can't get anything stopped. So, Jim, if you're interested in halting volatility, what you need is a budget process, because a budget process like we have in the United States government can slow anything down, including the stock market. Well, our current budgetary situation is, I suppose, as fouled up as it's ever been. As of October 16, when we officially failed to hit our budgetary deadlines for fiscal 1990, the Gramm-Rudman deficit reduction budget blade, that dreaded blade known as sequester, began to descend. That once threatening eventuality that we thought would signal the end of our political process has been notable this year in that almost no one has really noticed that sequester has begun, with the exception of a few editorial writers. Also, due largely to our continuing immobility on the deficit, we were to be faced this week, Wednesday, as a matter of fact, with the day of reckoning with regard to the national debt. This Wednesday, the United States Congress was scheduled to be asked to lift the debt ceiling to slightly over $3 trillion. On Wednesday, the federal government was supposed to come to a halt in this coming week, and many of us were poised for the flurry of last-minute action, acting in a crisis atmosphere in the best Washington tradition that would get our budget business behind us and to keep the federal government moving. But in this extraordinary year, we can't even seem to get to the cliffhangers on time. Last week, the Secretary of the Treasury, Nicholas Brady, magically produced a $17 billion borrowing authority that none of us in the Congress knew he had, a borrowing authority that will ensure the arrival of the next round of Social Security checks on time, which is very important. I don't have to tell some of you that. That removes all of the tension from the upcoming rise in the debt ceiling, with the probable consequence of no immediate action on the budget. What we're left with is what I perceive to be the curious spectacle of an American government struggling and getting nowhere. Sometimes I feel as if we're all running underwater. And that furious immobility contrasts starkly, I would submit, with virtually what's happening in virtually every other part of this globe. I don't think it's going too far to observe that we live in a time of truly seismic change. Change whose significance is hard to understand, and the outcome of these changes are difficult to predict. To borrow a metaphor from geology, whole continental plates are shifting beneath the surface. Shifts are occurring that, frankly, make the San Francisco earthquake look very small. Shifts are occurring across this globe that would seem fantastic just a few short years ago. In my own judgment, what we're seeing in the Soviet Union, what we're seeing in Eastern Europe, what we were seeing the tip of in China, is the triumph of economics over ideology. That's true on the rim of Asia, where new giants of economic production and efficiency have emerged just within the last decade. It's true in the Soviet Union, where ingrained stagnation is giving way to radical change for one reason and one reason alone: the failure of the Soviet economy to sustain the Soviet people. Last week, I had the great pleasure of meeting with the President of the Supreme Soviet, who was here in the United States with some of his colleagues from the Supreme Soviet. And I want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that these individuals who are communists and who wore the little flag of the Communist Party of the Soviet Socialist Republics didn't talk like communists to me. As a matter of fact, they sounded very similar to any Western politician that you might encounter who has to go before the people and seek the people's approval to be elected. So it's true what's happening in the Soviet Union is true in the whole Eastern Bloc, where a glacial totalitarian rule is slowly breaking up under the pressure of people's rising expectations. And their rising expectations for a better economic way of life and for a greater respect for human and political rights. I think the great irony of all that is clear. While Poland convenes a parliament led by Solidarity, not by communists, while Hungary openly adopts a democratic change, and the Soviet leadership said yesterday that they would not be disturbed if Hungary left the Eastern Bloc countries, left the Warsaw Pact militarily, while millions in East Germany demand an end to oppression. Here in the United States, the great model of the freedom that others seek, we stand frozen in indecision, uncertain about how to even pay for the relief for the great natural catastrophes that we suffered this summer and fall in Hurricane Hugo and the earthquake, unable even to promote the global trends that we've expended hundreds of billions of dollars worth of treasure to try to advance since the end of the Second World War. Incapable, really, this government, of sticking to even a prearranged consensus on how to deal with budget circumstances for this year. And what has this government frozen in this era of indecision? What is the single grain of sand that's appeared upon which the massive machine of the American government has been ground to a halt? My friends, the answer is the debate over the capital gains tax cut. The entire first year of the 101st Congress has largely become a footnote to what's occurring around the capital gains debate. Now, we had a bipartisan, bicameral budget resolution that was solemnly agreed to and endorsed by the President of the United States, agreed to at the earliest point of many, many years, and I might say based on some of the most uncontroversial spending and revenue decisions that we could make. This budget resolution was widely denounced as not doing enough, based on unrealistic economic expectations, and simply not getting the job done. Well, the reason for it was because it set, we hope, the precedent of a new administration and a new Congress working together at long last to address the physical problems of this nation. That agreement that was so inoffensive in all of its objectives began to unwind just a few weeks ago when it became apparent that the capital gains tax cut was going to be used by the administration to constitute a large block of the temporary necessary revenue increases to make this resolution break even. I must say that the administration's insistence on that tax cut has seemed particularly inappropriate to me as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, since such a tax cut would increase this nation's deficit. It's been estimated that the Jenkins proposal, which passed the House of Representatives, would lose some $21 billion in federal revenues by the end of this decade. The Senate version, once you include the losses of the IRA Plus, would be even worse. Now, the subordination of deficit reduction to capital gains, I think, unmask an iron difference or an iron indifference to the real source of this country's economic weakness. And that weakness is our continuing deficit, the burden of our growing debt service, which today is the fastest growing component of the federal budget, interest cost. And it leads to a greater and greater reliance on foreign capital. Some say, well, perhaps this is what's moved this nation from being the largest creditor nation to the largest debtor nation. Others say, don't worry, the United States has been a debtor nation before the First World War. Yes, that's true, but we were borrowing the money then to build the great railroads and to construct the underlying industrial base that made this nation the great colossus, the great economic colossus of the 20th century. Even as we moved later in the year toward an agreement that would take all the unnecessary elements out of the budget process this year, even as we sought to cleanse a reconciliation bill from all of the partisan pork barrel amendments that had been attached to it, a budget reconciliation that aimed for debt reduction and debt reduction alone, the Bush administration has clung single-mindedly to its capital gains proposal. As recently as last week, we had two examples of what I think is what I would characterize as capital gains obsession. The action I referred to earlier by the Secretary of the Treasury, postponing the moment of crisis with the debt limit, an action that cost taxpayers $20 million more than they would have paid if we'd acted in a timely fashion on the debt. That action was motivated exclusively, I would submit, by the administration's desire to buy time to impose a capital tax gain on the Senate. And finally, and I think the most disturbing of all instances of misplaced and disordered priorities, last week, the capital gains issue, which is really a tiny issue, I think, in the whole spectrum of affairs, last week the capital gains issue somehow managed to cast its shadow over the monumental developments that are occurring in Eastern Europe. The Senate is considering a major bill for Poland and Hungary. We are seeking backing for a $1 billion package of economic and technical assistance to Poland and Hungary. We want to see a modest $400 million private enterprise fund that will provide loans, grants, insurance guarantees to the growing private sectors of the economy in both the economies in both Poland and Hungary. We want to provide $200 million to Poland, as the President promised, to help with their balance of payments problems and to encourage the market economy initiatives that are moving heartily but need some help. We want to provide $125 million in food aid for Poland, for basic food staples at reasonable prices during their transition to a market economy. These are all very measured, very modest steps when you consider that Poland alone has a $9 billion problem. Modest steps to advance the cause of economic and political democracy in the Eastern Bloc. A goal that it seems to me is of paramount importance to anyone who cares about the progress of Western democracy in the post-war era. But onto this aid package, which was relatively uncontroversial, that had strong bipartisan support, the administration has forced the attachment of the capital gains issue. Here in the midst of a truly worldwide movement, matters of absolute significance, I would submit, to modern-day world history, we're going to have to delay aid to those that I perceive to be genuine freedom fighters, successful freedom fighters, I might add, so that we can debate the virtues of a capital gains tax. Now, I would ask, in all honesty, what are the priorities of this government? What are our priorities as a nation? Do we truly believe that the capital gains tax preference is somehow commensurate in importance with the global future of democracy, and particularly democracy in Eastern Europe? Now, I know that within this group there is a substantial majority in favor of a special tax treatment for capital gains. I'd say to you frankly that I don't necessarily believe that you represent a cross-section of the nation as a whole, which in my judgment is really largely unexcited about the capital gains issue. But I know that you have good and sufficient reason for your views and for your support of capital gains, and I don't challenge that. For my part, I was a supporter of capital gains treatment, was a strong supporter of it when the top rate of income was 90%. There was a strong argument for giving a special preferential treatment to capital gains. When it came down to 50%, I still supported capital gains, but there was less of an argument. It had less force. But now when the rate is down to 28%, the case for capital gains appears to me to be not nearly as strong as it was in earlier years. Of course, we can disagree on that, and I can understand your thinking and your reason for disagreeing. But nonetheless, even among the most committed capital gains adherents, I can't imagine that there is much support for holding the Poland-Hungary aid package hostage to the capital gains tax treatment initiative. Now, while I make no apology for my opposition to dealing with the capital gains issue during the budget process, or on the debt limit, or on the Poland-Hungary debate, I want to assure you that my real point is not a partisan one. My whole point in bringing all of this up deals with what I perceive to be a fundamental lack of priorities that can result in a mixing of issues that are of completely disproportionate magnitude, of obscuring the greater question by giving prominence to the lesser. And in my view, that is a symptom of, if I may use a discredited word from the Carter era, a symptom of an overall malaise. I submit that we've got a root problem in this country of ours. The problem is that we are unable to build even a modest consensus with regard to the fiscal policy of the United States government. Every time we try to enter into a debate of consequence about how we're going to portion out our efforts, we find ourselves bound by the twin shackles of too many demands on the one side and too few resources on the other. So we find that the United States is becoming a giant in chains here in the latter part of the 20th century. The fundamental issue before us is that of the physical condition of the United States government. Every debate, whether it's capital gains, whether it's Poland or Hungary, or whether it's to aid the victims of Hurricane Hugo or the victims of the earthquake in California, it all comes back to the fact that we have limited funds to parcel out among seemingly limited demands. And this is to say nothing about the needs for educating our population, to say nothing about what's to be done about this decaying infrastructure that we have around us. Because of the continuing demands and the continuing borrowing of our government to meet those demands, we have made no real progress on the federal deficit. More and more of our national wealth goes every year to pay for what occurred in the past. The trade deficit continues to widen. Productivity stalls out or goes down. The savings rate does not increase. And America's international standing goes down with them. The answer, of course, is to face our problems forthrightly, rather than looking for diversions year after year. You know, the minority leader of the United States Senate, a member of a party other than mine, Senator Dole said yesterday, forthrightly, that we ought to find revenues to fund our emergency efforts in South Carolina and California, and many of you may have seen him say that on Meet the Press. More leaders in this country and more leaders in the administration ought to follow the responsible course that was charted yesterday by the minority leader of the United States Senate. But I'm sorry to tell you today that there are indications that the Office of Management and Budget prefers another year of paralysis, another year of twists and another year of feints, to any kind of serious budgetary action. Right now, the Office of Management and Budget is looking favorably on allowing a full-scale sequester to take place. Rather, they say to have the cuts that are anonymous, that cut the good and the bad across the board, than taking the fundamental responsibility of government, which is to bring order out of chaos and to make the tough choices. Sequester would set the stage, I would submit, for another so-called slide-by budgetary year in fiscal 1991. A budgetary year with minimum deficit reduction and with a larger black box being offered to hide the pain of the cuts that may come and to avoid the blame when they do. And frankly, in my judgment, we simply cannot afford a repetition of this budget year. In fact, we can't afford to see this year end in its current state, in my judgment. So I want to take this opportunity to urge the administration to put its influence behind the most rapid resolution of our budgetary logjam. We can still get a reconciliation bill through this Congress. We can still get a clean debt ceiling bill through this Congress. We can lift this sequester that's cutting across the board, the good and the bad, and we can all work together to meet our responsibilities and fulfill the promise that was so obvious in the budget compromise that we entered into this spring. I thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if any are forthcoming.
Okay, all right. Do any of the participants have questions for Senator Sasser on the deficit or prospects? Or yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Senator, if the capital gains is such a problem, why is it that the Congress just doesn't come up with a capital gains bill of its own, reduce the capital gains, vote it up or down, and then it's done? It seems to me that the Congress is the one who's putting first in budget resolutions and then other places that seems to come to the paralysis that you mentioned.
Well, I think perhaps in my view, there will be some sort of capital gains package in all likelihood next year. It will emerge, in my view, as part of an overall economic package, perhaps an overall revenue package of some kind. But what's occurred in this instance is seeking to graft on the capital gains treatment after everything else had been done, and suddenly this emerges out of the closet, and it's the view of the Congress is, or the view of the Senate, is like the French at Verdun. They simply say, it shall not pass. We ought to modify it to say, it shall not pass this year. A lot of it goes back to the deal, so to speak, that was made in the 1986 tax reform bill that all of you are familiar with. And the deal was that we would do away with the top brackets. They would reduce the top bracket down to 28%, and in return for that, special tax treatment would be foregone on the part of individuals, and this tax reform bill would stay intact for a period of years to see how it operated, to see if it did indeed bring tax equity, and to see if it did indeed act to be an economic catalyst to the overall economy. Many who supported that 86 tax program believe very strongly in it, and they want to see it have a chance to work before we start changing it and grafting special tax treatment for different groups onto it. Here's one here.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yep.
Is there a compromise possible with tax gains cuts being offset by less interest rate deductibility?
Well, frankly, I don't see that coming. Don't see it coming this year, and I've not heard that being discussed at all. When we talk about offsets, most of the offsets that I am hearing are that allow the capital gains treatment and offset it by increasing the top bracket to 33%. That's one of the things that has been discussed quite a bit. But I've heard really no discussion of allowing, of tampering with the interest deduction. Of course, as you know, the 1986 tax code did disallow a substantial portion of the old interest deductions that could be made.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
All right,
thank you.
Mr. Shields.
Okay.
It's always good to see you.
Drive carefully.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Jim Sasser. Our next speaker, Robert Mosbacher, was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate in January 1989 as President Bush's Secretary of Commerce. He served previously as Chairman and CEO of Mosbacher Energy Company, as a Director of Texas Commerce Bank Shares, very active in the petroleum business, and two of his unlisted achievements. He was past Chairman of the American Association of Petroleum Landmen, past President rather, and past Chairman of the All-American Wildcatters Association. So a distinctly Texas flavor accompanies Mr. Mosbacher as he comes to Washington to do battle with us and the arrayed forces of benightedness that afflict every Secretary of Commerce. But let me just point out one other thing. He is no political neophyte or novice. He was National Chairman, Finance Committee Chairman for the President George Bush. He was Chairman of President Ford's Finance Committee, and he is no stranger to the precincts of the politics of the United States. Secretary of Commerce, Robert Mosbacher.
Well, after reading about who's been speaking to you gentlemen today and having had lunch with a couple of them, as a matter of fact, one of them being a little late for lunch, you may have been filled up to the brim with politics and attitudes, but my only claim is that I've only been in this business for about 9 or 10 months. And I've been on that side of the table or the rostrum the rest of my life, so I'm glad to be. I feel like I'm just up here on Lend-Lease, and I'll be back on that side one of these days. I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of our trade opportunities and problems. I think you've all heard a lot about EC 92, but from our perspective, it's been an interesting and ongoing both opportunity and problem. I think overall I'm fairly optimistic about it. I would have said perhaps 3 or 4 months ago I was extremely optimistic about it. I hope 6 months or a year from now I can move back in that direction. And the reason I've ratcheted down a little bit on my optimism is because, not solely because of any one reason, but I would say the broadcast directive was a big step in the wrong direction. It was partially cultural, they tell us. Others, frankly, in the governments over there, told us that it was even more because their broadcast capabilities were just nowhere near up to ours, and they needed a little protection to get them up. Now that was a pretty candid answer, if not the one that we'd like to hear most. But I think the fact that they are willing to take some heat to bring their television, radio, cinema capabilities up to speed and protect, while they're doing it, protect their culture a little, gives you an idea that they're not totally ready to receive the U.S. or anyone else with unmitigated joy. I think that we'll see some amelioration along the line, but I do feel that because we talked about other ways that they could protect their culture, as we do in some ways in this country through our PBS, having a more culturally directed set of programs very often rather than the most appealing to the general public in some cases. Oh, in truth, sure, the culture was involved, but it was, in my view, primarily an economic decision. And so I worry just a little about that. If it is the exception that proves the rule, if it's an aberration, I don't worry too much. But if it's a harbinger of things to come, I begin to get very concerned. We've also seen a couple of small acquisition attempts that were turned away, particularly in France, that make us just a little bit nervous, because we certainly want to keep an open investment posture in this country. This administration feels very strongly about that, with only the exception of it incursing itself in our national security. We continue to hold the attitude that we must keep an open view towards any investments here, and we would hope for and frankly expect, particularly in the EC, that they will do the same. And by and large they have. There have been a few exceptions that are slightly worrisome. Another area that has worried us a little is in the area of local content and place of origin. We've seen it in the semiconductor business, where there's a differential on the import duty and various gradations of how far finished these semiconductors are, which causes on two levels companies to need to go into Europe, or want to go into Europe, or feel they have to go into Europe to set up their own semiconductor plants. And the two levels are obviously for the present, the differential, though it's not major, on the import duty. And the other differential is, what is it going to mean for local content in the future? So whatever these semiconductors, memory chips go into, will they be counted against, if they are imported, counted against the local content? This has not been defined. It is something, though, that worries particularly middle-sized and smaller exporters from this country, because in some cases, sure, you want to set up plants in Europe, but it really should be optional and not something that they're forced to, the U.S. company is forced to do. So those are the concerns. We, of course, have the government purchasing, or public procurement, as it's sometimes called. That hasn't been decided, but anything that limits that to within the EC will, of course, be detrimental also. And we are heartened and happy to see the second banking directive, which gives national treatment to U.S. and other foreign banks that go in there, and we'd like to see it extended to the insurance and other financial services. So I'm going to say that there are a lot of areas that we are making progress with the EC 92 group. Those are some of the areas we worry about. I think that we're going to see the standards area, which we got much into the fray in the beginning of this early spring, moving well towards openness or transparency and towards prior notice on standards. But with standards comes testing and certification. And we want to make sure that we have these same things there. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot we must do to make sure that from a U.S. standpoint, foreign standpoint, EC 92 stays open. And yet I mention these problems not with the idea that I therefore view the whole European community in 1992 with doom and gloom. Quite the contrary. I'm still optimistic about it. But I do mention that there are areas that we need to keep pressure on, that we need to be watching and a little wary of. I think when you talk about a $4 trillion market, which that is, the economy's that size of 320 million people, it is so important that it can't be overstated as far as what we need to do to make sure that U.S. exporters have an opportunity to go there. And while I'm talking about U.S. exporters, I've got to say that it's becoming a larger and larger segment of the U.S. economy. Still less than half of what it is of any other major Western or Eastern Pacific nation in percentage, but 3 to 4 times what it was 10 to 20 years ago. But you know, we had about 2% of our GNP had anything to do with export items. I think it was about 15 years ago, and now it's between 8 and 9%. So we're moving up. You know, we move up to a lot of the European countries, and or of course, obviously, some of the Pacific Rim countries, and we're talking about more like 20+%. It's something we must learn to do more of. We must, the companies that some of whom you represent here and others with whom you do business, must think world market. We in government must do what we can to help open up that world market for you, and you on your side of the table must realize that it is one big and getting smaller competitive world. So if you want to work on an economy of size and scale, you've got to be opening your markets around the world. I think, have learned that painfully from our European and Pacific, particularly our Pacific, and obviously most of all from our Japanese friends. And of course, a part of that is quality. And the quality aspect can't be overemphasized. We're trying to emphasize it through the Malcolm Baldrige Award, which, as a matter of fact, tomorrow the President will be presenting to some few companies who, by showing through long and arduous reviews that they are building the quality of their product and capability up, they are the top of the heap, and they are in a position to win this most prestigious award in manufacturing. And it's not limited to big companies, but it has not been applied for over a broad spectrum, but it should be. And the application itself helps companies build quality into their products and into their thinking, along with long-term viewing, which is another part of what we must do, because our cost of capital is so high. Cost of capital, as you know better than any, is more than twice what it is in Japan, and a lot higher than many European countries. Lowering our capital gains tax rate will both help lower the cost of capital, will make us think longer term because the holding period will be longer. And I think we must pursue this area, which the President has put forth, in the tax code, through that, and through making R&D tax credit permanent, and through other types of antitrust help and other areas where the government can help free industry to compete better. So those are some of the things we're working on. Japan, we all are familiar with the market opening efforts. I believe, though I told you I'm always an optimist, I believe we're making a little progress. I believe I perhaps upset some people in Japan, for which I'm extremely sorry and unhappy, because that isn't, I don't think, anything that we should ever do in someone else's country. But all I said was that the Japanese consumer pays 50% more than the U.S. consumer, and that is just factual. And I think it struck a note because it's true, and I think, as a matter of fact, the Prime Minister, Kai-Fu, said many of the same things a short time later. So we're working in those areas, but rather than ramble on about there or Mexico or anywhere else, why don't I just turn it over to a Q&A, and thank you for having me here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Who has the first question for Secretary Mosbacher? Right over here. Yes.
You have talked about exports, but you haven't talked about the import side. And since your past is in the energy sector, I was wondering what is your view on the dependency on foreign oil of the U.S., and what will you do to change that?
Well, I have to talk about oil. Let me tell you, there are two reasons I can't answer your question on oil or gas. Well, I can repeat. There was a question about a dependency on foreign oil, but I'm not allowed to answer it on two grounds. One, because it was a business I was in for 40 years, I'm recused, which is governmentese for being excused, and may not answer because it's part of my confirmation, and therefore I may not talk about it in public forum. The second is the old Washington law, which most of you must know by now, and that is, if you know anything about the problem, you can't be part of the answer, though. That. Sorry.
Any non-energy questions for Secretary Mosbacher?
Can I ask a question in relation to the building of aeroplanes? There appeared to be a dispute in relation to how the Airbus aeroplanes were built and how profitable they were and who was funding what. Is that resolution now, has
if you're talking about the consortium in Europe that is subsidized, I don't know why that should be any more problem than anything else that's being subsidized continually in huge amounts by the governments over there. It is some more statesman-like people would say, a vexing problem that has no immediate solution. And because everybody is so busy in the industry at this point, you're absolutely right. I don't think it's being focused on now, and we hope there will be some privatization as has been begun in Germany, though a flawed one because of the fixing of the exchange rates that goes with it. But perhaps in some ways it'll get solved. It needs to be.
Any other hands? No other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Is Speaker Foley here yet? Let me just- Speaker Tom Foley, Speaker of the House. Will be here momentarily. In the as we wait for his arrival, let me just add a couple of thoughts to what has been said today. I was asked by a couple of people at lunch just what President Bush's position was politically in this country compared to that of President Reagan. And I think it's fair to say, without detracting in any way from President Bush, that President Reagan, to a great degree, made the Bush presidency not simply possible, but made the first 8 months of it entirely pleasant. By that, I simply would cite these factors for that conclusion. First of all, Ronald Reagan made it okay again in the United States to like a president. We had been 20 years without a two-term president, a series of failed, flawed, and tragically ended presidencies, a war four presidents could not explain, end, or prosecute in Southeast Asia that took 58,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Asian lives, and left the nation in two armed camps politically, double-digit inflation, energy crises, impeachment, assassinations, and Ronald Reagan left in 1989 with the approval rating of 65% of his fellow citizens as a successful president. That was something that none of his predecessors had done or been able to do since Dwight Eisenhower. And this impulse of ours to compare presidents to their predecessors is deeply ingrained in American politics and among American people. It's best put, as many things are in Washington, by Senator Bob Dole, the Republican leader of the Senate. He was talking about this comparing presidents to their predecessors, and a black tie dinner at this very hotel, seated at the head table were former President Jimmy Carter, former President Gerald Ford, and former President Richard Nixon. That's pretty big time by our standards. Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon are, as Bob Dole described them, see no evil, hear no evil, and evil. But Ronald Reagan not only left George Bush in good shape politically, he effected a rather remarkable handoff to him of political leadership, quite unlike that Dwight Eisenhower had been unable to do for Richard Nixon in 1960 when he was his vice president, or Lyndon Johnson was able to do or inclined to do in 1968 when Hubert Humphrey was his vice president. And basically, George Bush has benefited from support from two basic fundamental groups in this country: those who supported and endorsed the Reagan Revolution and what it accomplished, and see George Bush as the defender and protector and preserver of that revolution, and those who objected to the excesses, abuses, and indifference of the Reagan era and see George Bush as the person who's going to correct those excesses, abuses, and indifference, especially in the areas of education, the environment, and civil rights. So I think those are the, I think just as a preliminary commentary on what Bush has going for him right now, a certain debt of gratitude is owed to Ronald Reagan. I will interrupt my cosmic viewing to bring to you the next and very important speaker, the number 2 individual in line for the presidency of the United States. After the Vice President is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Thomas S. Foley of Washington. Prior to his election as the 49th Speaker of the House, last June, Tom Foley was the House Majority Leader for 2 years, from 1981 to 1987. He's not here. I'm sorry, I just had a signal to move it along. I apologize. He's not here. At least when he does get here, you will know, in fact, what he did do prior to his not getting here. When he does get here, could somebody tell me that he is here, in fact? I appreciate that. Well, Tom, I'll just tell you what Tom Foley's done. Tom Foley, from 81 to 87, was the majority whip of his party in the House of Representatives. He's from Spokane, Washington. He is has been elected to the Congress consecutively each 2 years since 1964 from what was a Republican district, but which is now a very safe Foley district. And he is a graduate of the University of Washington and its School of Law. But until he does get here and we give him a rousing reception, to indicate that he is here. Let me just continue a couple of random thoughts I had that were really prompted from today's presentations, and that is that Ronald Reagan not only made this effective handoff of power to George Bush, but even during the campaign of 1988, when George Bush had to, which was inevitable, establish his own independence. A terrible job of being a vice president is that you have two role models you can pursue. You can be a cheerleader for the administration and the president, just whooping up support before party partisans and loyalists for every policy, or you can be a hatchet man, calling the opposition party ethical eunuchs and moral lepers on a daily basis. Neither one is a terribly attractive long-term occupational prospect, and once a vice president is chosen to run for president, he has to immediately establish his independence, as George Bush did that in the campaign of 1988, especially in the areas of the environment and education. Ronald Reagan was quite gracious and never wavered at all in his support for him. The reality of our politics right now is that George Bush came to power as having won Ronald Reagan's third term. And I think that's the best way to put the Bush victory. I said earlier today, American politics about change and optimism. In 1988, the Democrats, in the candidacy of Michael Dukakis, represented a little change and virtually no optimism. And the Republicans in the candidacy of George Bush represented some optimism and very little change. So when George Bush did come to office in 1989, he was left with a Democratic Party in total disarray, thanks in large part to Ronald Reagan, again, because Ronald Reagan had twice vanquished the party, carried 93 of 100 states in 2 elections, 44 one time, 49 the next. The Democrats in 1988 had wanted nothing more than to run against George Bush. That was their fondest hope. The Democrats' belief was that our politics, which is not class-based in large degree, but where the Republicans have been perceived as the party tilting to the rich and to large business over the years, the Republican Party had always been shrewd enough and astute enough to only nominate as its standard bearer for president the sons of America's working class and middle class background. One can go right back from Ronald Reagan himself to Jerry Ford, to Richard Nixon, to Dwight Eisenhower, Herbert Hoover, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt before anybody finds the Republican Party nominating a candidate for president who was born to privilege, education, and affluence. And the Democrats' fond hope was that George Bush would be seen as the candidate of the quiche and Chardonnay set, and someone who did not understand their problems, the problems of ordinary people. That proved to be quite flawed. The Democrats, having nominated the Greek-American governor of Massachusetts, who became known not affectionately as Zorba the Clerk, as the campaign progressed, and George Bush did win a resounding victory. The problem with that victory was when George Bush came to Washington in January of '89 as the president-elect, as the new president, he was deprived of what had been his predecessor's most effective vehicle for generating and galvanizing action, both popular and legislative, upon taking office. And that was to find fault with your predecessor. If one thinks about it, Richard Nixon came to power in 1968 after 8 years of Democrats. Jimmy Carter came to office in 1976 after 8 years of Republicans. Ronald Reagan came to office in 1980 after 4 years of Democrats. Each time, there was the political equivalent of a hostile takeover. And the new president could come in and say, my God almighty, things are worse than I thought they were. I mean, they're really bad. There's no money in petty cash. There's no stamps in the postage meter. What we really have to do is do something. These guys were really worse than I thought they were. And we'd, American people and our optimists say, okay, Mr. New President, what do you need? And the new president basically got what he initially asked for. George Bush could not come to office in January of '89 and say, my God almighty, will you look at this deficit? Where the hell did it come from? What about this S&L crisis? Who was Secretary of the Treasury? Well, it was your fellow who's Secretary of State, Mr. President. Oh, I mean, he was really deprived of that opportunity, and I think that that left him with a little bit of a difficulty, which he is quite frankly still harboring with. But he was Reagan, most of all, left him with the Democrats in disarray, and with as the first American president in our history. Certainly the post-Cold War era, who benefited politically from at home by just getting along with the Soviets. Every other American president in the Cold War era had to first establish that he was a tough guy ready to deal with the Soviets. By simply getting along with the Soviets, George Bush has benefited politically. Now, they say the Democrats have been in disarray. One man who is striving mightily, and I think effectively, to pull them from that disarray, and I do want to assure him that I have already gone over his curriculum vitae in considerable length with the group as I vamped waiting for his arrival from Capitol Hill, the 49th Speaker of the House, Thomas S. Foley of Washington. Speaker Foley. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry a bit late. Traffic in afternoon Washington is a little bit precarious sometimes. I'm told that I'm expected to speak for about 10 minutes. Is that correct? And then perhaps go to questions. So I'll try to stay within those guidelines. The administration that came into office in January of 1989, a Republican administration, was a clearly decisive winner in the 1988 election, but the American people also chose by an equally decisive decision to elect a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. Whether political scientists like the arrangement or not, the American voter seems to be quite satisfied, even delighted, to have a divided government with the Democrats in charge of one branch and the Republicans in charge of another. And no amount of suggestion that this perhaps is less than efficacious seems to have any particular weight with them. Something over 120 Democrats in the House of Representatives were elected in districts strongly carried by George Bush. And the likelihood for this to continue based on at least past experience is relatively high, I suppose, although we're not giving up on the Democratic side the chance of electing a president in 1992. For the most of the years since the end of World War II, there has been a Democratic Congress in office and a Republican president. And those periods have seen, frankly, very effective government. It's judged by the Marshall Plan and the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s and many other legislative milestones. Whether this arrangement will work effectively or not, we're in the process of discovering month by month and week by week. President Bush said he did not think the American people sent us to Washington to bicker, and I think that is probably true. They did not send us necessarily to agree on everything either. And from my perspective, the early optimism of bipartisan cooperation on the central issues of domestic policy has been clouded recently. I put the blame personally, obviously with some partisanship, squarely on the proposal to reduce capital gains taxes. I think that was the wooden cross, so to speak, wooden stake through the opportunity for a bipartisan agreement on next year's budget. And whether that opportunity has been lost totally or not is, again, something that lies in the weeks and months ahead. The president says, well, he supported the capital gains reduction in his campaign. But of course, American history is replete with examples where presidents and members of the Congress proposed things in their campaigns that they didn't feel were necessarily responsibly enacted after they were elected. I say personally that there are two great sins in American politics. The more venal and light-hearted sin is committed by politicians who don't keep their campaign promises. The more serious and dangerous sin is committed by politicians who keep their campaign promises. And I think you could probably find in our history all sorts of examples of the country being much better off after people made promises and then had the good sense not to try to keep them. Even beyond the question of whether a permanent and reduction in capital gains is a good or bad idea, I think its timing was very unfortunate. In the 1990 budget cycle, we agreed that Congress, both houses, both parties, and the President on a budget plan. And we were committed to work for the next budget year, 1991 budget year. That is still a commitment that we will keep and we will honor, but I think the chances of reaching an agreement is seriously eroded, as I said, by the proposal. Why? Well, first of all, most people, I think, privately, if not publicly in Washington, will concede that little has been done in a major way to reduce the deficit. We've been managing it, not entirely well and mostly marginally. What really is needed to do something significant on the budget, again, most people agree, including people in the business community, business economists, academics, people in political life, are three things: restrain entitlement growth, restrain the growth of discretionary spending both in the domestic and the military area, and raise taxes. Now, taxes will not be raised as long as the President opposes it. That is an absolute given. There is no chance, physical certitude, that the Congress cannot and will not attempt to raise taxes without the President's advance signal that he will sign the bill. To my knowledge, there have been few, if any, times in American history where the Congress has passed a tax bill over the President's veto, except in those cases where the President wanted higher taxes than the Congress, and the Congress chose to override him on a veto when he thought that taxes should be higher and the Congress thought they should be lower. Senator Dole said yesterday that he would favor a gasoline tax in order to deal with the problems of infrastructure. Indeed, I think that it's a very good reason to have a raise in the gasoline tax. We have serious infrastructural problems in the United States, and highway user fees, if you want to call them that, or gasoline taxes, are the principal way in which we have financed major infrastructural developments in the United States. Yet today, the United States, of all the industrial countries in the world, has the lowest gasoline tax of all, dramatically lower than Europe. Those in the room, I gather from European countries, will, I think, attest to the fact that gasoline prices in France, I think, are something close to $1 a liter. They're a little over $1 a gallon in the United States. Most of that difference is tax. We use 100 billion gallons of gasoline in the United States annually. For every penny of federal gasoline tax, the result is about $1 billion of revenue to the Treasury. But there isn't going to be a federal gasoline tax, nor will it be advanced in the Congress without the support of the President in advance. So, to a large extent, by his deliberate determination to say that there will be no new gasoline or any other kinds of taxes, the President has, I think, made effective budget discussions, I'm talking of underline effective here, discussions that would seriously move toward reduction of the deficit, impossible. And I think he has signaled that he does not put them on a very high priority. I think that's sad, but it cannot be overcome by the Congress, and it remains for the President to decide when he wishes to put the deficit forward as a major policy, reduction of the deficit as a major policy initiative on the part of the government. If he does so in a meaningful way, he will have bipartisan support. But until he does, I think we have the sad fact that we will continue to do marginal changes in deficit reduction with all the dangers that that presents in the event that we go into a slowdown or worse in the economy. In domestic policy, in addition to having an infrastructural deficit and a fiscal deficit, we have a social deficit, a deficit in education, in health, and in areas of crime and family organization, for which money is not by any means the only answer, but in most cases it has some important role in what might be the answer. I think Americans are increasingly impressed and depressed by the fact that American children tend to score at the lower end of almost all industrial countries' education profiles in mathematics and sciences, and both physical and biological sciences and geography. And it's a major problem for employers today in many urban areas to find qualified applicants to do entry-level jobs with basic skills. This is something that cannot be avoided much longer without the United States putting itself at great jeopardy in terms of international competition, industrial and other economic competition. In foreign affairs, there's a happier, I think, condition. The United States is finally in a situation where some of the problems, such as Central America, have a more bipartisan approach. The administration, having abandoned desires to obtain military aid for the Contras and working with the Congress, we've agreed to humanitarian funding of the Contras until the elections can be completed next February in Nicaragua. And there is some review of this on November 30th, but my judgment is that this is one of those areas which we have fortunately put aside in terms of partisan disagreement. The other area is South Africa. I think there is also an effort to try to find a common approach that will assist in the development of a movement of South Africa toward the end of apartheid. And from a standpoint of a kind of tour d'horizon of the world, there is little, if any, area that I can quickly identify where there are major partisan disagreements over political foreign policy questions. In trade and economic policy, there are some nuances, sometimes sharper than nuances perhaps, but there is an overstatement on the part of some that we have had several years of bickering or disagreement over foreign policy, with the exception of Nicaragua and South Africa, and perhaps some areas such as Angola. There has been basically the continuation of the bipartisan foreign policy attitudes that the United States has had since the end of World War II. Again, some difference in emphasis. Democrats think the president ought to be bolder and more active in responding to the historic changes that are taking place in Eastern Europe today, more aggressive perhaps in seizing opportunities as the Soviet Union's policy both toward Eastern Europe and the West is changing so quickly, but those are again differences of degree and not of fundamental policy. Bismarck is reported to have said once that God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. We perhaps relied on that a bit in the past. I'm not pessimistic about the future. I think the United States is well on its way to addressing some of its more serious internal problems. The major disappointment I have is that we are not moving more aggressively and more in bipartisan cooperation on reducing the deficit. There is no excuse for this country racking up something close to $1 trillion of debt every 5.5 or 6 years. That's unconscionable in my judgment, particularly in times of relative prosperity and a relatively high working economy. But if there is a problem that I see, it's that in the last administration, repeated in this one, there is a successful political threat against the raising of revenue, and that which is not the only way or by any means that we should deal with the deficit, but it's an integral part of it. And as long as revenue is frozen, our ability to deal with the deficit and to deal with a number of other problems that we have in the country is sharply constrained. And I regret that, but that decision to stay with that policy or to alter it lies almost exclusively, for all practical purposes, exclusively with the President. I have a strong commitment to bipartisanship. My general political background, I think, speaks of that. I am not interested in carrying on a political campaign day after day waiting until the next election. There are committees in this city, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, that are devoted to that purpose and little else. They have no governmental responsibility. They have no governmental interest except to elect the partisans of whichever party they serve. But those of us in the Congress, in both parties, and the President have a responsibility to do for the country what we were elected to do, which is to address problems and to resolve them in the interests of the nation and its broader international responsibilities. So I don't really want to see the Congress involved in a long, protracted political fight with the President. There are, however, people on both sides of the aisle and in the executive branch and in the Congress who favor that in terms of some greater goal, some longer ranged vision. And I think it's fair to say that in both parties and in both branches, there are those who feel that we should harden the lines and prepare for the 1990 elections and make little efforts, particularly to soften the disputes, to take the case really to the people in 1990 and beyond. In 1991, 1992, obviously we approach a presidential election. In my judgment, there is an opportunity in the next several weeks, perhaps months, to turn from that political course, that hardened and ever-hardening political preparation for the elections, using the issues of government as campaign issues rather than problems to be solved. And if it is not taken in the next 2 or 3 months, I think it will be very difficult to change the course until the beginning of 1991. And at that point, we may move quickly into another fatal trap, which is the political magnet of the 1992 elections. I think at that point, we'll all bow our heads for a moment and pray for the country, and then I'll take whatever questions you'd like to offer. Thank you.
The question right over here.
Is it your contention, sir, that failure to address the problem of the budget will mean depression for the United States?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Depression.
Depression?
Yes.
If I'm correct, the question is, do I believe that the failure to deal with the deficit will lead to a depression in the United States? Is that correct? No, not necessarily. I think we've ignored this problem for decades now, and we haven't reached more than a moderate recession in 1992 or 1982. My concern is that if we do have a slowdown independently of this, or something that might be called a recession, then the means of dealing with the deficit become much more difficult and complicated. Raising taxes and cutting spending in a time of recession is not classically indicated by most economic policy. And besides, we'd have a very difficult time carrying that kind of austerity policy in a time of recession anyway, politically. And that could lead us into even more severe problems and perhaps turn a recession into something more serious. So I'm worried about it. It's one of the reasons I think we're very foolish and irresponsible not to deal with it more dramatically now when the economy is still functioning fairly well.
Yes, over here.
What do you think are 2 or 3 of the most realistic bipartisan actions that we could employ to reduce the deficit? Or are there any?
Well, no, there are some. I had the role of being the chairman of the Special Budget Task Force after the market crash on October 19, 1987, when the administration sent Jim Baker and Howard Baker to see the then Speaker, Jim Wright, and suggest that we get together House and Senate Republicans and Democrats in the administration to see what we could do to reach a budget agreement. We did reach one after about 20 days, and it became part of the next budget cycle as well as the current one at the time. It was important, valuable, but we were on the verge of doing a much bigger budget agreement than we actually achieved. And what prevented us from doing that is we couldn't put together the sort of political agreement that would be necessary to insulate everybody from unpopular decisions. Now, let me give the outline of that agreement that almost was, so you have some idea what I'm talking about. One idea was a 6-month freeze on all increases in government spending, plus a 6-month freeze on all COLAs, all cost of living allowances, Social Security, veterans, civil and military retirement, every kind of COLA in the federal government, reducing from 4.2 to 2.1 the effective annual cost of living allowance. 6-month freeze, then on full COLA for the next 6 months, effectively cut those COLAs in half. Because COLAs are built on COLAs, cost of living allowances are built on cost of living allowances, there is a budget delta that becomes very important as you get into what we call the out years, because there's a lower COLA every year if you do nothing more after you cut the first year COLA in half. Thirdly, there was a proposal to freeze all tax reductions scheduled in law, i.e. the reductions in the 1986 tax bill affecting tax rates, the previously enacted inheritance tax reductions, all would be frozen for 6 months. They would have the same eventual outcome. There would just be a standing in place for 6 months. So this proposal, the latter one, was described by one of the administration participants as unacceptable to the president, the tax freeze. In fact, it was said rather colorfully, the president will agree to that sometime between his impeachment by the House of Representatives and his formal trial in the U.S. Senate. Others could not agree on the Social Security cuts. They weren't cuts, that's not the right word. Social Security restraint on the COLAs. And many did not like other aspects of it, restraint in agriculture programs, defense, and so forth. But if that could have been put together, and we were like 85% of the way to putting it together, down to the point that we were thinking about how it would be announced. It would be announced at the White House by the President in the presence of the leadership of both parties, House and Senate, and the special invited presence of Frank Fahrenkopf, Republican National Committee Chairman, Paul Kirk, Democratic National Committee Chairman, and then the 4 campaign chairmen of the House and the Senate, John Kerry, Rudy Boschwitz, Guy Vanderjack, and Burl Anthony. And we would aim at simultaneous endorsements from the 2 national parties, the idea being to insulate this as much as possible from the 1988 elections. That's what has to happen. If Republicans say, well, we'll agree with you, but we'll go out and attack Democrats for raising taxes, or Democrats say, we'll agree with you, but we'll go out and attack Republicans for cutting Social Security, you're not going to get the kind of action that's needed to deal seriously with the deficit. And for example, just this last week, Lee Atwater put out a press release saying that catastrophic health insurance proposals were a Democratic effort to tax the elderly. You know, if you look at the roll call, you'll find an awful lot of Republicans voted for catastrophic health, and the present position of the administration is to oppose repeal of it. If you want to ask Mr. Atwater, why doesn't President Bush go along with the repeal of what you call a Democratic tax on the elderly, I think the answer would be interesting. That's the kind of problem we have when we deal with these very sensitive national issues affecting the budget and the deficit, because they involve generally unpleasant things. You can't do a lot of good with a deficit and be cheered along by the public. It requires a certain single message of both parties, and it requires a certain restraint in spending, and that's not popular, and a certain increase in revenues, and that's not popular. Administrations in Congress like to cut taxes, not raise them, believe it or not. Cut taxes and increase spending. Administrations and the Congress. When we go into budget talks, for example, the administration wants generally 3 things from their side of the discussion. As high a defense budget as possible, as high a foreign assistance budget as possible, and minimum, if any, taxes, and maximum reductions in domestic policy. The Democrats usually approach it somewhat the opposite. They want to take the maximum cuts in defense, take the minimum cuts in domestic programs, and find some way to get revenues in the package. And as a consequence, we usually don't come to agreement on any of these things. We have a thinly veiled agreement which manages, as I say, the deficit. It was $149 billion in 1987. It was $152 billion in 1988. And this year, I think the figures are $151 billion. So we're standing still pretty much on the deficit. If anything, it's being eroded slightly by inflation. Yes?
Given what's happening in Eastern Europe, might it not be that in the next few years a bigger than expected reduction in defence spending would be acceptable to all sides and help you to square the circle on the deficit?
The question is, in view of what's happening in Eastern Europe, isn't it possible that a bigger than expected reduction in defense spending might be accepted on all sides and help in reducing the deficit? I think that'll happen over time. The problem is if we do unilateral reductions in defense, particularly on force levels, without Soviet action on their side at the same time, we have people in our both parties, frankly, that worry that the Soviet forthcoming and positive discussion is not necessarily being realized in actual decision. What I would like to see is a speed up of both the START talks and the conventional weapons agreements so that the cutbacks can be in accordance with arms control agreements rather than just unilateral. The way to save money is to reduce the force levels. I mean, that's one of the quick ways to do it. But until there is some agreement to do that or some corollary action on the Soviet side, it would be difficult to get deep cuts in the domestic defense budget. There are people who suggest, I'm not one of them, who have a phrase that say the Soviet Union is much less threatening but slightly more dangerous, is their argument, because of the uncertainty and instability in the country. But most Americans, I think, see this as a positive development, overwhelmingly as a positive development, and also believe that it perhaps is a key to some future restraint on defense spending. Yes?
Do you see any interest in changing the present debt favoring over equity on a corporate level?
Well, I think there's a lot of people who would favor it, but we are not particularly adventuresome in the Congress in involving ourselves in the procedures of capital formation. There's a certain reluctance to intrude in that area. It's probably proof that the Congress is essentially very conservative when it comes to major questions involving capital formation. Though I think most people, I can't really say this scientifically, but my intuition says that most people in the Congress view the recent spate of debt from leveraged buyouts and junk bonds and so on to be wholly regrettable and have done little positively in the economy except to run up enormously the levels of corporate debt and put many companies at some risk in the case of a sharp downturn in the business cycle or increase in interest rates. I don't think many people in Congress are enthusiastic about that whole period we've gone through with 800 or 900 billion, nobody knows exactly how much of new debt. And while we'd be willing to encourage equity, the question is how we do that. Again, let me take one final shot at the capital gains proposal. The House proposal, which is now being debated in the Senate, is without any merit, in my judgment, in encouraging capital formation. It doesn't do anything to do that. It rewards, over a 2-year span, assets that have already appreciated and allows a kind of a fire sale on the tax rate to be closed again after 2 years without any promises for the future at all. And what that does to encourage, and particularly long-term equity investment, isn't clear to me.
To that conference since a couple of years, and each time I have heard the same talks about the necessity to reduce the budget. And I must say that nothing changed, and the level of the budget deficit is the same. So I have two questions. First, what will, in your opinion, change that stalemate? And second, don't politicians think that maybe the American public had the maturity to accept to tighten the belt for a while in order to put order in the House?
May I repeat the question or the comment question? The question or the comment, first of all, is that the gentleman's been attending these conferences for many years and he's heard the same thing, that we need to reduce the deficit, but nothing has happened. And the question is, don't politicians think, well, first of all, what will it take to get the deficit reduced? And two, don't politicians believe that the American people have the maturity to accept a certain amount of restraint in order to achieve deficit reduction? Let me answer them in reverse order. As a practicing politician, everybody in the House has a constituency, and I do myself. I think that the public is largely rhetorically concerned about the deficit. One doesn't have the feeling that you're going to be accosted on the street by citizens saying, what are you doing about the deficit? Why aren't you doing more about the deficit? What's your excuse? In fact, the deficit, it's been suggested by Senator Moynihan, is seductive with the public. They don't see anything particularly wrong, some of them, about getting $1 worth of government services for about 80 cents. That's the good old American tradition of a discount. Secondly, do they have the maturity to accept short-term pain for long-term benefit? Yes, I think they do if they clearly see that that is necessary. And what that means to me is that both sides of the political spectrum have to be saying the same thing. If one side is the stern nurse, the Margaret Thatcherite stern nurse that's saying, take this medicine, it's bitter, but it'll be good for you, and the other is saying, that medicine never did anybody any good, have a milkshake, enjoy yourself. It's not an easy argument to carry. Third, there is a difference, and I think perhaps we're disadvantaged here, between the United States political system and most parliamentary systems in other countries, Japan, Western Europe, and so forth. Usually parliamentary systems, of course, have a univocal government. There is one government in a majority of the parliament, and except for those cases where there's coalition, you don't have to worry too much about the other party until the next election. If you apply that to the United States, we in the Congress say that if we were a parliamentary country, we would be a democratic government because we have more members of the Congress than the administration. The administration tells that differently. But in any event, we run for office in the House every 2 years, and a third of the Senate runs every 2 years, and the President runs every 4 years. In most parliamentary countries, you have 4 or 5 years between the initiation of a government and the time it must go to the country for an election. We have to depend upon sort of a bipartisanship being present to avoid a political taking of advantage of those sterner measures. And by the way, because our political system doesn't have great discipline, we can't do what other countries can do, which is when parties are in coalition, they enforce their policies against their own members. For example, if you had a situation where the Greens and the SPD and the Christian Democrats in Germany all took the same position, it would be most unlikely that candidates would be campaigning for any of these parties openly opposed to their policies. But in the United States, that is typical of candidates running as Republicans or Democrats and disagreeing with the position of their national party or their national party leaders and picking up great credit in some places of the country for their independence and their general above-politics attitude. So we need, at least on the incumbent level, support for incumbent. What will it take? It will take either a development of a political will, which I haven't quite yet seen, leadership by the President and by the Congress, but first of all by the President, or some serious threat to the economy that also presents the danger of crippling the effort as well as stimulating it. Yes, sir.
You talk of political accountability, but isn't there a significant problem with the influence that the political action committees have, where 95% of the incumbents are reelected year after year, and that there will be no real political change unless the Congress is willing to stand up and change the political action committee rules?
Well, the political action committees are just part of the, I don't know if you all heard the question. Hear the question, why don't we change the political action committee rules because too many incumbents are being elected and there really won't be a fair kind of political contest, I gather the question, as long as those political action committees give mainly to incumbents. Well, here I am a trifle inclined to recall that some years ago, when it was assumed that all business and trade association political action committees would give most of their money to Republicans, my friend Guy Vanderjack was going around the country saying that it was a God-given duty, at least a patriotic obligation, of every business group in the country to organize a political action committee. Suddenly, not so fast, as the evidence is that they do tend to give at least a reasonable amount of their resources to incumbents. But I don't think that that alone is the explanation for incumbency. We just won an election in Mississippi where a Democratic candidate won 65 to 35 against a 4 or 5 to 1 financed Republican. In an open seat where there's no incumbent at all. And in fact, over the last 10 or 15 years, if you look at open seats where there's no incumbent, the majority of those elected are Democrats, roughly in proportion that they bear now in their majorities in the House and the Senate. A third fact, that it's often assumed that that incumbency re-election creates a lack of movement in the House, a sort of an ossification. President Reagan said one time that there was more turnover in the Supreme Soviet than there was in the United States House of Representatives. So I asked a group of foreign correspondents one time, British, French, Italian, German foreign correspondents, what they thought the turnover rate was during President Reagan's term in office in the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats. What was the turnover rate? Well, because many of them had read the stories about 1% loss of incumbents, they guessed around 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8%. The actual figure is that during that period, there was a 55% turnover in the House of Representatives in the 10 years from 1980 to 1990. If you go back to 1974, the turnover is about 81%. And if you go back to the year in which I joined the Congress in 1965, the turnover rate is 93%. So, of course, people run for other offices, they die, for various reasons they leave the House. But I think the political action committees are only one part of the effort to look at some reform in the election process. Here again we have certain differences between Democrats and Republicans that they're unusual in the field of ethics. For example, in ethical reform we don't really have any partisan differences at all. But in campaign reform and election practice, Republicans generally would like to see more party money brought in. They'd like to see the parties be able to give more money. Well, if you have 3-to-1 financial fundraising capacity over the other party, that's a good thing to propose. They would also like to see individual contributions raised. The Democrats, on the other hand, want spending limits. Their view of campaign reform is too much money is being spent. We ought to reduce the maximum level of spending with some means or other. We're working with a common group to try to resolve those issues. And there is a possibility of PAC contributions being reduced, but I think only as a part of a broader campaign reform. Yes?
Is the line item veto likely to be an important issue, and what would the political dynamics of this thing be?
Is the line item veto likely to be a campaign issue? Important issue, and what are the political dynamics of it? I recall that President Lyndon Johnson wanted the line item veto, and a Democratic Congress in 1965 declined to give it to him. Not all Republicans are for a line item veto either. Mickey Edwards, former chairman of the American Conservative Union, argues very forcefully that giving a line item veto to an already powerful president enhances the office of the executive beyond that which any conservative should feel comfortable with. And my variation of that is to think, if you will, of your worst nightmare as President of the United States. Those who are not American citizens cannot think of this, but those who are American citizens out there, think of your worst nightmare as President of the United States. Ralph Nader, Ted Kennedy, I don't know what it is, but imagine it yourself and then decide whether you want him to have a line item veto. And if your answer is still yes, you are consistent. However, I think you're wrong still. I wouldn't give a line item veto to my best friend as president. I don't think it's going to become a major issue. I don't think the president is going to be successful if he attempts to impose it without a constitutional amendment. I think it would fail in the court reviews, which would surely follow it. And as it is, the presidential veto is very powerful. The president just last week vetoed the Health and Human Services bill, one of the least controversial of all appropriation bills, the one that wraps up education and health and things that are voted for virtually unanimously in the Congress. And that veto was not overturned when he vetoed it on what is generally an unpopular notion in the United States, that poor women who are victims of rape or incest should not receive federally funded Medicare. The public opinion polls don't support that, but the president's veto was sustained because he doesn't have to have a majority. All he has to have is 1/3 of one of the two bodies. And if he were to have that on every line of every legislative item, it would be an enormous power to present to him that I believe the Founding Fathers never anticipated nor would have granted. Well, thank you very much. I hope that by this time next year, if you return and ask the question, what have we done on the deficit, I'll be able to say this and this and this, and now it is much lower than it was a year ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Speaker Foley. Perhaps after that presentation, you have some idea why Congressman Henry Hyde of Illinois, one of the leading conservative Republicans in the House of Representatives, said, "I only wish Tom Foley were a Republican." I would just add one item in closing, and that is that what Speaker Foley touched on is a reality that's developed in American politics, which nobody really understands where it came from, how it will end, but we know how it expresses itself, and that is there is a split-level nature to American politics. It really is a rational, if not totally logical, decision that's been made by American voters. When American voters are asked in 1989 which party is better at maintaining a strong national defense, they overwhelmingly answer Republican. Which party is better at dealing with the Soviet Union? Republican. Which party is better at controlling inflation? Republicans. Those are big, important questions. However, when those very same voters are asked which party is better at protecting the middle class, protecting Social Security and Medicare, protecting the environment, providing quality education, a decided edge goes to the Democrats. And at least one political analysis goes that helps to explain if one thinks of those first questions and tasks of governing, dealing with the Soviets, maintaining a strong national defense, controlling inflation. Those are responsibilities that most Americans identify, logically, with the president. As far as representing my interest as a citizen, making sure there isn't a toxic waste dump in the next neighborhood, making sure that Grandpa's Social Security check is there the first of the month, at those tasks, the American voters give a big edge to the Democrats, and I think that perhaps helps explain why they continue to elect Democrats to the Congress while electing Republicans to the White House. At best, it's a theory. I've enjoyed being with you, and we look forward to having dinner with you this evening. Thank you very, very much.